You don't belong here." The words didn't echo, but they didn't need to. They slid across the rooftop like cold air, sharp enough to cut through the low hum of jazz and the clink of crystal glasses. And for a moment, even the skyline of Manhattan seemed to pause, lights blinking in silent witness. Ethan Caldwell leaned back in his chair, perfectly tailored suit, cufflinks catching the amber glow. A man who had never once questioned whether he owned every room he walked into. And across from him stood Naomi Brooks. Black uniform pressed, posture straight, hands steady on a tray that suddenly felt heavier than it should, not because of the weight, but because of the silence that followed. No one spoke, not the investors, not the executives, not the men who had laughed at every one of Ethan's jokes just seconds earlier, because something in the way he said it, calm, casual, almost bored, made it clear this wasn't humor, this was hierarchy. Naomi didn't react, not visibly. She didn't flinch, didn't lower her gaze, didn't offer the kind of apologetic smile the room expected from someone in her position. She simply nodded once, the way professionals do, and stepped forward to refill his glass, the bourbon swirling like liquid gold as it caught the light. But her eyes, they were focused, alert, listening, because while Ethan talked, he wasn't just talking to the room, he was leaning slightly toward his overseas partners, switching into a language he assumed no one else understood, his tone shifting. Sharper now, more strategic, words moving quickly, outlining numbers, conditions, a hidden clause buried beneath polished charm, the kind of detail that could flip a $50 million deal without anyone noticing until it was too late. Naomi heard every word, not by accident, not by guess, but because years before this night, before the uniform, before the double shifts and quiet endurance, she had spent late nights buried in textbooks, studying languages most people never even attempted, teaching herself the patterns, the rhythm, the meaning behind conversations people thought were invisible. But she said nothing, not yet, because timing, she had learned, was everything. Ethan laughed again, louder this time, drawing attention back to himself as if the room had dared to forget who was in control, and he glanced at Naomi with that same dismissive amusement, tapping his glass lightly against the table. "You probably didn't catch a word of that, did you?" he said, the corner of his mouth lifting, a challenge disguised as a joke, and a few people chuckled, not because it was funny, but because they knew better than to disagree. Naomi set the bottle down gently, the sound barely audible, her expression calm, unreadable, and in that moment, no one noticed the shift, not the subtle change in the air, not the way the balance in the room began to tilt, not yet, because Ethan Caldwell still believed he was the smartest man at the table, and Naomi Brooks was still, to him, just a waitress. The room did not recover right away. It shifted, subtle but real, like pressure changing before a storm, and Ethan could feel it even if he could not explain it. The way conversation slowed, the way one of the investors leaned back just slightly, studying him instead of agreeing with him. And he did not like that feeling, not one bit, because Ethan Caldwell was not used to being studied. He was used to being followed. He straightened his posture, adjusting his cufflinks with practiced precision, reclaiming control in the only way he knew how, by speaking louder, by smiling wider, by turning everything into a performance again. "You know what?" he said, glancing around the table as if inviting everyone back into his orbit. "Let us make this interesting." And there it was, that tone, playful on the surface, sharp underneath. The kind of tone that always came before he reminded people exactly where they stood. Naomi remained beside the table, still, composed, her presence quiet, but anchored, and if anyone had looked closely, they would have noticed her breathing, slow and even, not nervous, not rushed, but measured, like someone waiting for the exact right second. Ethan lifted his glass slightly, gesturing toward her without really looking at her. "If you understood even one sentence of what I just said," he continued, letting the words stretch just enough to draw attention, "I will give you $10,000 right now." A few people laughed, some out of habit, others out of discomfort, because they knew this was no longer about a joke. This was about drawing a line. Naomi did not respond immediately, and that pause, that small, controlled silence, made the room lean in without realizing it. Because silence, when used right, can be louder than anything. Ethan tilted his head, amused, expecting compliance, expecting the usual, the nod, the retreat, the quiet acceptance of a place already assigned. But Naomi did something else, something so small it almost went unnoticed at first. She stepped forward, not rushed, not hesitant, just one step, placing herself within the center of the conversation rather than the edges of it. Her voice, when it came, was calm, clear, and steady, not raised, not defensive, just precise. And she repeated his entire conversation, word for word, every number, every condition, every hidden implication he thought had been safely tucked away in a language no one else could reach. And as the meaning unfolded in plain English, the shift in the room was no longer subtle. It was undeniable. One investor's smile faded, another leaned forward, brows tightening. And across the table, Ethan's expression did something rare. It paused, just for a second, as if his mind needed time to catch up to what his ears had just heard. Naomi did not stop there, because understanding was only part of it. She continued, gently but firmly pointing out the inconsistency in his proposal, the clause that contradicted his earlier statement, the risk that had been buried beneath confidence. And suddenly the narrative Ethan had been building all night, the carefully constructed image of control and certainty, began to crack, not loudly, not dramatically, but in a way that mattered far more, in the way people looked at him, in the way trust quietly stepped back. And in that moment, without raising her voice, without breaking her composure, Naomi Brooks was no longer invisible. She was undeniable. The silence did not break all at once. It fractured, piece by piece, like glass under pressure, and every person at that table felt it in their own way, in the tightening of their grip on a glass, in the shift of a glance, in the sudden awareness that something had just changed and could not be undone. Ethan Caldwell did not speak immediately, and that alone was enough to unsettle the room. Because men like him filled silence, they controlled it, they shaped it, but now it was holding him. Instead, he forced a small laugh, controlled, measured, the kind that tried to pull everything back into place. Well, he said, leaning forward slightly, eyes narrowing just enough to study Naomi more carefully. That is impressive, but the word did not land the way he intended, because it was not admiration, it was recalculation. Across the table, one of the senior partners cleared his throat softly, no longer looking at Ethan with automatic agreement, but with something sharper, something analytical. Is that true? He asked, not loudly, but clearly enough that everyone heard it. And just like that, the balance shifted again, this time away from Ethan. Naomi did not rush to answer. She did not fill the space. She simply met the partner's gaze and nodded once. Calm, certain, the kind of certainty that does not need decoration. And then she added, in the same steady tone, clarifying the exact line, the exact number, the exact condition that had been misrepresented, not accusing, not attacking, just stating, like someone who understood that truth did not need volume to carry weight. Ethan felt it then, not just the attention, but the doubt, the quiet, creeping doubt that moved through the room like a current. And doubt was something he had spent his entire career eliminating. He straightened again, sharper this time, voice firmer. Let us not get distracted, he said, trying to steer the conversation back, to regain the rhythm he knew so well. But the rhythm was gone, replaced by hesitation, by questions forming behind polite expressions. Another investor leaned in, flipping through a document, eyes scanning faster now, no longer trusting the summary, no longer relying on Ethan's confidence to fill in the gaps. And that was the real shift, not the words Naomi had spoken, but what they had triggered. Naomi stepped back slightly then, not retreating, but allowing the moment to unfold without her, because she understood something Ethan did not, that once truth enters a room, it does not need to stay at the center to do its work. Ethan looked at her again, really looked this time, not at the uniform, not at the role he had assigned her, but at the presence she carried. And for the first time that night, there was no amusement in his expression, no easy confidence, just a flicker of something unfamiliar, something close to realization. Because the room he thought he controlled was no longer responding to him. It was responding to her, to the clarity she had introduced, to the doubt she had exposed. And in that quiet, undeniable shift, Ethan Caldwell began to understand that this was not a moment he could simply talk his way out of. This was a moment that would define what happened next. The conversation did not return to normal. It slowed, thickened, like air before a storm, and every second that passed without Ethan fully regaining control made the tension sharper, more visible, more dangerous to his authority. One of the partners adjusted his glasses and looked directly at Ethan, no longer smiling, no longer entertained. "We need to revisit that clause," he said, voice calm but firm. And that single sentence carried more weight than any raised voice ever could, because it was not emotion, it was decision. Ethan nodded once, controlled, composed on the surface, but inside, something was shifting, something unfamiliar, because this was not how his meetings went, not how his deals unfolded. He was supposed to lead, to dictate, to close, not to explain. He reached for the document, flipping to the section in question, his movements precise, deliberate, buying himself time. But the rhythm was broken, the flow interrupted, and everyone could feel it. Naomi stood just a step behind, no longer at the center, but no longer invisible either. Her presence now anchored in the room in a way that could not be undone. And she did not look at Ethan. She looked at the table, at the people, at the unfolding consequence. Because she understood that this moment was no longer about her speaking. It was about what her words had set in motion. "It is a standard structure," Ethan said, voice steady, measured, trying to rebuild confidence piece by piece, but the words landed differently now, not as assurance, but as defense, and defense, in rooms like this, was always noticed. Another investor leaned forward, tapping the page lightly. "Standard does not mean transparent," he replied, and the temperature of the conversation dropped another degree. Colder now, sharper, more exact. Ethan exhaled slowly, barely visible, and for the first time that night, he did something he rarely allowed himself to do. He hesitated, not long, not enough for most people to call it out, but enough for the room to register that something was off, that certainty had been replaced by calculation. Across the skyline, lights flickered, reflections dancing across the glass walls, and inside that room, power was being quietly reassigned, not through noise, not through force, but through perception, through trust, through the subtle realization that the person they had been relying on might not be as in control as he appeared. Naomi shifted her weight slightly, hands still steady, her expression calm, but her eyes observant, taking in every reaction, every glance, every shift in tone, because she knew something most people in that room were just beginning to understand. That power was not just about who spoke the loudest. It was about who held the truth when it mattered most. Ethan closed the document slowly, placing it on the table with care, as if control could be restored through precision alone. And then he looked up, not at the partners, not at the skyline, but at Naomi, and in that look, there was no laughter left, no dismissal, only recognition, quiet, reluctant, but real. Because the woman he had reduced to a role minutes ago had just altered the trajectory of a deal he had spent months building, and the room, the same room he believed he owned, was no longer responding to him the way it had before. The room did not rush forward. It lingered in that fragile space between certainty and doubt, where every word carried more weight than before, and Ethan could feel it pressing in from every direction, not loud, not aggressive, but undeniable. One of the investors closed his folder slowly, not with frustration, but with intention. "We are going to need full clarity before moving forward," he said, his tone neutral, but the message clear, and in rooms like this, clarity was another word for control, and control had just shifted away from Ethan. He nodded. Of course he nodded, because men like him always maintained composure, always adapted in real time. But beneath that polished surface, something else was happening, something quieter, more dangerous. His certainty was no longer absolute. It was conditional. He leaned back slightly, exhaling through his nose, recalibrating. And then he did what he had always done best. He pivoted. "Of course," he said, voice smooth again, measured. "Rebuilding. We can walk through every detail together." And it sounded right. It sounded like leadership, but it no longer felt like dominance. It felt like recovery. Across the table, the partners exchanged brief glances, subtle, quick, but meaningful, the kind of silent communication that happens when trust is being reconsidered, not broken. Not yet, but questioned. Naomi remained where she was, still composed, still quiet. But now the room was aware of her in a way that could not be undone. An awareness, once given, does not disappear. It settles. It stays. It changes how people see everything that follows. One of the younger executives glanced at her, then back at Ethan, then at the documents, as if recalculating the entire situation in real time. Because the narrative had shifted, and when narratives shift, decisions follow. Ethan noticed it. All of it. The glances, the hesitation, the subtle distance that had formed between him and the people who, minutes ago, had been fully aligned with him. And for the first time that night, the realization was not just intellectual, it was personal, because this was not just about a clause, not just about a deal. It was about perception, about credibility, about the invisible currency that determined who truly held power in a room like this. He looked at Naomi again, but this time there was no trace of dismissal, no casual superiority, only focus, sharp and searching, as if trying to understand how someone he had overlooked so easily had just rewritten the atmosphere of an entire negotiation. Naomi met his gaze for a brief second, not challenging, not submissive, simply present. And in that moment, something unspoken passed between them, not conflict, not agreement, but recognition, the kind that does not need words to be understood. Then she stepped back, returning to her role without announcement, without performance, picking up the bottle, adjusting a glass, moving as she had before, but nothing about her presence was the same anymore, because the room had changed, and so had the way it saw her. Ethan watched that shift, not in her movement, but in the reactions around him, the way no one ignored her now, the way even silence acknowledged her, and that was when the weight of what had happened fully settled in, not as embarrassment, not as anger, but as something far more unsettling. The realization that control is not lost in loud moments. It is lost in quiet ones, and tonight, it had slipped from his hands without a single raised voice. The meeting did not collapse. It transformed, slowly, quietly, into something far more controlled and far less certain, and Ethan could feel the difference in every second that passed. In the way questions replaced assumptions, in the way every statement he made was now measured against something deeper than confidence. One of the senior partners leaned back, fingers steepled, studying Ethan with a level of attention that had not been there before. "Walk us through the revised structure," he said, not as a suggestion, but as a requirement. And that single request carried a shift in authority that no one needed to announce. Ethan nodded, again, always composed, always precise, and he began to speak, outlining the terms, the projections, the safeguards, his voice steady, his delivery sharp. But now there was something underneath it, something new, a subtle awareness that every word had to earn its place, that nothing would be accepted at face value anymore. Across the table, documents were no longer glanced at. They were examined, pages turned with intention, numbers checked, clauses read line by line. And the rhythm of the room had changed from performance to verification. Naomi moved quietly along the edge of the space, refilling glasses, clearing plates, her steps measured, her presence calm. But now every movement existed within a different context, not invisible labor, but silent awareness, and even those who did not look directly at her felt it, the shift in how she occupied the room. Ethan continued, adapting, refining, recalibrating in real time, doing what had made him successful for years. But success built on control behaves differently when control is questioned, and he knew it, even if he did not show it. One of the investors paused him mid-sentence, not abruptly, but firmly. "And the contingency on that clause?" he asked, eyes steady, and for a fraction of a second, just a fraction, Ethan hesitated, not because he did not know the answer, but because he understood what the question represented, not curiosity, but scrutiny. He answered, of course he answered, clean, precise, but the room did not move on as quickly as it would have before. The answer was considered, weighed, held in the air just long enough to signal that trust was no longer automatic. Naomi noticed it all, the pacing, the pauses, the recalibration of authority, and she did not interfere, she did not insert herself again, because she understood that the most powerful moment had already happened. Everything now was consequence. Ethan finished his explanation and allowed a brief silence to settle. Controlled, intentional, the kind of silence he used to command, but now it did not belong to him entirely. It belonged to the room, to the collective judgment forming behind composed expressions. Then, slowly, one of the partners nodded, not in agreement, but in acknowledgement. "We will need to review this further," he said. And the words were calm, professional, but they carried a delay, a distance, a decision not yet made. Ethan inclined his head slightly, accepting it, because there was nothing else to do, no argument to force, no dominance to assert without risking more than he could afford. Naomi placed a final glass on the table, her movements as quiet as ever, but as she stepped back, there was a difference in how the room held her, not as background, not as service, but as presence, as part of the moment that had shifted everything. And Ethan, standing at the center of a room he had always controlled, realized something he had never needed to consider before. That power is not defined by who starts the conversation, but by who changes its direction, and tonight, that had not been him. The meeting did not end with a handshake. It ended with distance, the kind that does not need to be announced, the kind that settles quietly between people who were once aligned and are now reconsidering everything. And as chairs shifted and documents were gathered, the room began to move again, but not with the same energy it had before. Conversations broke into smaller pieces, low voices, measured tones, no longer orbiting Ethan, no longer waiting for his lead, and that absence, that subtle withdrawal, carried more weight than any direct rejection could have. Ethan stood still for a moment longer than necessary, watching it unfold, not reacting, not interrupting, because there was nothing to interrupt. The shift had already happened. One of the partners approached him, offering a polite nod, professional, composed. "We will be in touch after our review," he said, and the words were standard, expected even. But the tone was different, less certain, less committed, and Ethan recognized it immediately, because he had used that same tone himself in meetings where the outcome had already been decided but not yet spoken. He returned the nod, controlled, respectful, every movement calculated, to preserve what remained of his position. But inside, the realization had settled fully now. This deal, the one he had walked in expecting to close, was no longer his to command. Across the room, Naomi continued her work, clearing the last of the glasses, aligning the table with quiet precision, her movements unchanged, but the atmosphere around her was not. People noticed her now, not openly, not dramatically, but in the way their eyes lingered for a second longer, in the way their posture adjusted slightly when she passed, as if acknowledging something they had missed before. One of the junior associates hesitated near her, almost speaking, then thinking better of it, offering a small nod instead, and that small gesture, barely visible, marked a shift far greater than any applause ever could. Ethan saw it, every detail, every glance, every recalibration, and he understood something that could not be undone. Respect, once redirected, does not easily return to its original place. He adjusted his jacket, smoothing the fabric with practiced ease, reclaiming what composure he could, and as he turned to leave, his eyes found Naomi again, not by accident, not casually, but deliberately, and this time, there was no trace of the man who had dismissed her minutes earlier, no arrogance, no amusement, only a quiet, unmistakable acknowledgement. Naomi met his gaze briefly, her expression unchanged, calm, steady, not seeking validation, not rejecting it either, simply present, and in that moment, the balance between them was clear, not equal in status, not equal in position, but shifted in a way that neither of them could ignore. Ethan gave the slightest nod, almost imperceptible, but intentional, and then he turned, walking toward the exit, the city lights reflecting across the glass as he disappeared into the night. A man who still had everything he walked in with, the wealth, the title, the influence, but who had left something behind without realizing it until it was too late. And Naomi, standing in the quiet aftermath, did not celebrate, did not pause. She simply continued, because for her, this was never about proving something. It was about being something, something the room had finally been forced to see. The rooftop grew quieter as the last guests filtered out, the city below continuing its restless motion while inside. The air held onto something that had not yet settled, something unresolved, and Naomi could feel it even as she cleared the final table, aligning silverware, wiping the faint rings left by expensive glasses, restoring order to a space that had briefly revealed its cracks. The staff moved around her with practiced efficiency, but their glances were different now, subtle, curious, not intrusive but aware, as if they had witnessed something they could not quite explain, only feel. One of the servers leaned in slightly as she passed, lowering his voice just enough. "What was that back there?" he asked, not accusing, not joking, just genuinely uncertain, and Naomi paused for a fraction of a second before continuing, her answer simple, steady, "Just doing my job," because to her, that was the truth, not the version the room had experienced, but the one she lived by. Outside, the glass doors opened again, a soft rush of cool night air slipping into the space, and for a moment, it seemed like nothing more than the city breathing, until footsteps followed, measured, deliberate, not rushed but intentional, and Naomi did not need to turn to know who it was. Ethan Caldwell stepped back onto the rooftop, not with the presence of a man reclaiming control, but with the awareness of someone who had left something unfinished, his posture still composed, his suit still perfect, but his expression quieter now, stripped of the performance that had defined him earlier. He stopped a few feet away, not too close, not distant either, a space that respected boundaries, without needing to announce them, and for a brief moment, neither of them spoke, because some conversations do not begin with words, they begin with understanding. Ethan exhaled slowly, not out of frustration, but out of recognition, as if organizing thoughts that did not fit into his usual patterns. "You changed the outcome in that room," he said finally, his voice lower than before, not commanding, not dismissive, just honest, and honesty, for someone like him, carried a different weight. Naomi looked at him then, not surprised, not impressed, simply attentive, and she did not rush to respond, because she understood that what he was saying was not a compliment, it was an admission. "No," she said after a moment, her tone calm, grounded. "I just made sure everyone understood what was already there." And the difference between those two perspectives, subtle as it seemed, held everything. Ethan nodded slightly, absorbing that, because for the first time that night, he was not listening to respond. He was listening to learn, and that shift, small but real, was something he had not expected to encounter in a place he thought he controlled. The city lights reflected in the glass behind them, stretching endlessly, a reminder that the world outside this moment was still moving, still turning, but inside this space, something had paused. Something had been rewritten. Ethan glanced back toward the empty table, the documents, the chairs now still, and then back at Naomi, and in that quiet exchange, there was no longer a question of who held power in that moment, only a recognition that power had taken a form he had not accounted for, one that did not announce itself, did not demand attention, but changed everything the moment it was seen. The night did not end with a dramatic conclusion. It settled into something quieter, something more lasting, as the last of the city lights stretched across the glass and the rooftop returned to its usual stillness. But nothing about that night was truly the same. Ethan remained where he stood for a moment longer, not because he needed to speak again, but because he understood that some moments do not require more words. They require acknowledgement, and for a man who had built his life on being heard, learning when to simply stand in silence was a different kind of power. Naomi turned back to her work, not dismissing him, not inviting more conversation, just continuing, because her sense of purpose did not depend on who was watching or who was finally paying attention. It had been there long before this night, long before this room, long before him. Ethan watched that for a second, the steadiness, the absence of performance, and something in that realization stayed with him, because he had spent years mastering how to control rooms, how to command outcomes, how to ensure that every interaction moved in his favor. But what he had witnessed here was something entirely different, something that did not push, did not dominate, did not announce itself, and yet it shifted everything. He gave a final nod, small but deliberate, not as a gesture of authority, but of respect, the kind that is not offered lightly. And then he turned, walking away without the certainty he had arrived. But with something else in its place, something quieter, but far more difficult to ignore. Naomi finished setting the last table, her hands steady, her movements precise. And as she stepped back, looking over the room now restored to order, there was no sense of victory, no need for recognition. Only the quiet understanding that what mattered had already happened. The room had seen her, not as a role, not as a background presence, but as a force of clarity, of truth, and once seen that way, it could never fully return to what it was before. Outside, the city continued its endless motion, millions of people moving through their own stories, their own moments of being overlooked or underestimated, their own chances to speak or remain silent, and somewhere in that vast rhythm, this night would become just another story, unless someone chose to remember what it really meant. Because it was never about a deal, never about a single conversation. It was about something deeper, something that does not belong to titles or wealth or position. It was about the kind of strength that does not need permission, the kind of intelligence that does not ask to be recognized, the kind of dignity that does not wait to be given. And in a room built on power, where money spoke the loudest and status filled every corner, the most important voice that night had been the one no one expected to hear, not because it was louder, but because it was true, and long after the deal was reviewed, long after the contracts were reconsidered, long after the names and numbers changed, what remained was that moment, when the room shifted, when perception changed, when one quiet voice reminded everyone of something they had forgotten. Power can open doors, but it cannot define what matters inside them. And that night, without raising her voice, without asking for attention, Naomi Brooks had done something far more powerful. She had made the room listen.